Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are going to talk about collections management systems, or for some of us, content management systems. The title of this particular webinar is CMS 101, Searching, Procuring, and Implementing. And it's going to be a pretty big webinar for us. It has an ambitious outline, but I really wanted to try and give you the whole process and a sense of that whole process in terms of what steps we need to take in order to have an effective search for a product, how you go through the selection, vetting, and procuring process. And then, of course, once you get the product, the job is not done. You now need to implement it and probably migrate your content from one system to another. It is a big job. It's often very overwhelming, especially if you've not gone through one of these before. So I am very excited to do this webinar with you today, and I do plan on doing some more focused webinars on the collections management system and digital collections in general all throughout this next year. So this serves as a great foundation webinar to any of the other ones that I do later on. So, quick note about me. I know many of you have probably already attended one of my webinars, but just in case you're new to me, I am Rachel Christine Woody. I own Rachel Christine Consulting, and I serve libraries, archives, museums, and cultural heritage organizations. I've been in the field for 15 years and have since been independently consulting for going on 4 years now full time. So, I've had a great opportunity to meet all sizes, shapes, and types of collections and organizations. I have a couple different specialties, but the one that's important today is my expertise in digital collections management and having a specialization of digitization technology, especially cutting edge technology. I love playing and figuring out the new tools. And then, of course, digital project management. That's a huge piece, especially when we're looking at collections management systems. And then the digital usership side of that. So, whatever we're doing with our digital projects, we need to make sure that they are effective. And that, of course, means understanding our digital users and knowing what they're looking for and whether or not they are able to engage with our digital collections in the way they want to. And then, of course, with my resume, I've launched multiple digital projects. Most of them have had that cutting edge technology piece or something like collaborative portals, which is becoming more and more common and very appealing to granting agencies. And then the nitty gritty of it. So, helping to manage migrations of collections information, especially into a new collections management system. So just a few items of housekeeping. This session is pre-recorded so that I can deliver the maximum amount of information to you, hopefully within an hour time frame. And then any of the questions that you've sent to me ahead of time, I have worked to either incorporate them into this webinar or include them at the end. A link to this recording will be made available. All of these webinars publish onto my YouTube channel, and if you've registered for this webinar, you will get a link to that the following day. And then please feel free if you are joining this premiere, there's a chat box to the right of your screen, and you can use that if you have a Google account to submit your resources, your own examples, your questions as we go through this, and I'll be monitoring that as we go along. And then, of course, please remember and respect that this content is my intellectual property, and so all of those applicable laws and courtesies apply. And just one more thing for accessibility purposes, if you are watching the webinar, it's on a sort of a tiny screen depending on the device you're using. If you hover over the window in this right corner, you can get a full screen option. And then, of course, I want you to notice that there's a closed captioning option, whether you're at the premiere or watching this later. YouTube does auto captioning and it's really good now, so I encourage you to use that if you need it. Okay, getting into the content. Here's what we're going to cover: scenarios that lead to a new CMS, a review of system types, anticipated CMS costs, how to find initial CMS options to consider, and that helps inform the procurement process, how to structure an effective procurement team, which is very important, how to create CMS specifications, which will help you go through the rest of the process, We're going to review 6 steps for a smooth CMS implementation and migration, and then cover CMS tools that can help increase that digital user engagement, which is very important. And then we'll explore how the CMS is critical to the museum income stream. And I use museum as a placeholder here for any type of organization. Collections management system can help you support those income streams, which is important for us to know. And then examples of what a good CMS can do and how to make that case for a better museum CMS to decision makers. And so again, museum's a placeholder here, but it could be archives, cultural heritage organization, library collection, etc. If you have a collection, it doesn't matter what the collection is, you need a management system and you have decision makers that you will have to make that case to. Okay, why are we here? So typically, this is one of the more frequent areas I receive questions, requests for expertise, etc. And the reason why that is because this is a very highly technical process. It is a very long and big process, and it can be very overwhelming. So if you are feeling any of those things, know that you are not alone. We are collection experts. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're also technologists or experts in databases, essentially. So know that you are not alone in that. And so typically, we're looking at a highly technical process and an extensive process. So you may have picked up that I noticed, or I had stated digital project management, which is a whole little niche of project management. And that's because this process, depending on how big your collection is, depending on how big your organization is, depending on what platform you get or what platform you're migrating from, it can take a long time. For a lot of my clients, their timeline, and granted, everybody also still has their other jobs they have to do. But typically, with all of that into account, it takes about a year in terms of searching, selecting, vetting, implementing, and then getting it out and officially published to the world. Also, this process takes substantial amount of time and energy, and so we are often very thoughtful people. If you're attending this webinar, you're one of those people, and you want to make sure that you're doing this process right so that you're not making any potential mistakes and you're not wasting any of your time or energy because those resources are finite. Another thing is that there are multiple opinions and restrictions. So we may be here because we are the collection caretakers, managers. However, we're not the only ones making a decision on what system we get, and we have to navigate all of those different stakeholders, use cases, legal and technical restrictions, you name it. And then this process, this whole goal of choosing a new collections management system is potentially very costly. There's the cost of the system to keep in mind, and then there's some additional costs that we'll go over in a minute on one of our near future slides. So here are the scenarios that lead to getting a new collections management system. I know for some people, especially if you're newer to the profession, it may seem like if you already have a system in place, that's it. You don't need another one. And many of us have kept systems for a decade or so. However, there are several reasons as to why it may be a good idea to change your CMS, and here's a couple of them. There's an increase or decrease in your CMS budget. Unfortunately, right now, often it's decrease in CMS budget, but maybe you're a happy case of more resources for this. A next scenario I see is that the museum staff interest or ability to use the CMS changes. So maybe there's a turnover in staff, maybe you're having to rely on volunteers more, or maybe you're actually able to hire a registrar or an expert to help do some of that cataloging. And so the needs and the people who are using it have changed. And then there's a shift in how the technology is used. So this one is a little less common, but in some of these scenarios that I see, there is a new staff member, for example, who has an interest or a specialty in using the system a little bit more robustly, and that's not an option. And so the need for that technology and that mechanism has changed. Then there's a change in operating system requirements. So maybe something has changed in the ecosystem for you of the technology being used, and therefore that's necessitating an operating system change, especially with this last year with the pandemic and a lot of shift to remote working. If you were not already on a system that was cloud-based in terms of being able to access your database, then that was a problem, and probably necessitated several of us having to change what systems we use. And then, of course, the next scenario is that the CMS dies and becomes outdated, or it's been acquired and merged with a different company product and it's no longer serving you in the way you need. So this one is perhaps the most common, or at least the most commonly heard about, because at this point in time in the 2020s, collections management systems have been around in their somewhat technical form for several decades. And we have seen them come and go in terms of software that used to be based on FileMaker Pro, for example, software that's not cloud-based anymore, and they've been slow to make that shift. All of those types of products I have seen be abandoned by clients because they're so outdated that even if the vendor is still there, they're just not making any more meaningful updates to that product. And that's why we need to change. Okay, briefly, I want to cover the different types of systems. I'm not going to go too in depth on this, but I did want to give you an idea of the options of the types of systems we're looking at. And so the first one, and the one that we typically hear a lot, especially if we're at organizations where their budget is very tight, is open source. And open source typically means that it's also free or freeware. Of course, if free is a loose term, the product might be free, but in order to like implement it and buy the server space and host it, et cetera, there are additional costs there. Um, but open source, whether it is free or not, means that you can help contribute to the code. It means that the source code is usually transparently available to everyone, and that anybody could supply plugins, updates, adaptations to that system that you could have access to, usually for free. The next one is commercial, and that can be an off-the-shelf commercial product. So just like you buy it off the virtual shelf, so to speak, install it, you're good to go. Or it can be a commercial customized option. So many of the larger vendor companies, they have a range of products from off-the-shelf plug and play to you needing a customized instance, whether it's back end and or front end. The next option, of course, is 100% customized. So this could mean that your organization has the technical expertise necessary to build your product from scratch. This was typically seen as a more common option for bigger institutions a decade or so ago when there just wasn't a product that fit their needs. At this point, though, it's typically viewed as a bad idea unless you know that your organization is going to have this technical expertise and the resources to support a 100% customized system for the foreseeable future. If not, then it's not a good idea unless you're working with a vendor who will be around for the foreseeable future to not only help you build that 100% customized product, but then help you maintain it and update it. And then there is niche versus general versus all-encompassing. There are, I think, 100 or so now different digital collections management systems out there. Now, some of them may be very industry specific in terms of library system, archive system, museum system. However, others are starting to come out where they're not necessarily for a specific industry. And so if you have a collection, the product that is available, you can dictate how you want that project or product to manage your collections. So there's a bit more of a general approach with those systems, but they are able to be customized to your industry and best practices. And then there's the all-encompassing ones, and this is usually from the bigger vendors where they're starting to realize that libraries, archives, museums don't exist on their own all the time, that there are many instances where you have a library and an archives in a museum, or you have an archives within a library within a university, that kind of thing, and that there is an interest and use cases for needing those collections to be within one system and yet still respecting some differing best practices. So that's what we mean by an all-encompassing system. And then just a quick note on support and placement, because this is something that is easy to forget, but that you need to think about just in case your organization has some needs or restrictions around this. The first one is that there are support contracts, and then there's software as a service. And so for products that you're buying or that are free that you can download and use, there may or may not be a support contract that comes with that. For example, Omeka or Omeka, however you want to say it, is a free product, but if you don't have a place to install and implement Omeka and load your collections to, you're going to need a support contract not only to help implement that product, but then also to help be a place where you store those collection items with their records. And then software as a service, if you think about like Microsoft Office or Adobe Cloud Suite, where it's a subscription model, you pay an annual fee and you get the use of that software, you license the use of the software on an annual basis typically. And then in terms of placement, at this point, we're seeing cloud versus local in situ. Many of the products that are newer and a bit more intuitive, and certainly where we're heading, where I'm seeing as a consultant we're heading, is cloud-based entirely. That means the system can be accessed and is cloud-based, as well as all of your items that you are uploading. Those are also being uploaded into the cloud, so to speak. Versus local and in situ. Some of the clients that I work with, they, for various reasons, have to maintain control and security over that server where the software and your items will live. So that's local in situ, and that's something you need to be aware of and investigate to see if you have a restriction or preference for where these things are placed. So getting into cost. Now, of course, this depends on what system you use, whether you have the technical abilities to do some of this stuff on your own versus needing to pay for it all through a vendor or a support contract. But then there's also some hidden costs, right? It's not just the product costs. There are all the costs that go with this type of activity. So just a quick snapshot, we've got, when we're thinking of a product, cost can be based on user or how many licenses you need, and that can be based on how many people use it at the same time, or how many people use it in general based on like username profiles. Another way that I have seen cost be determined is by item. This one is a little less popular than like per gigabyte because typically items can range in size, and really where the cost is coming from is not necessarily how many item records there are, it's how much server space, cloud space they are taking up. That is the cost there to the vendor or to if you're storing it locally. So that is typically how the costs are calculated for that, and something to keep in mind when you're looking at systems, and something to do the math on, because you should know, hopefully, how many items and the storage they're taking up currently in your existing system. And then there is when you are moving to a new system, or if you don't have a system, you're buying it new and starting from scratch, there's going to be a setup and implementation cost, even if you're doing it with a free product. So if you're working with a vendor, they are typically the ones that do that setup and work with your team and start to do the implementation. And that has a usual one-time added cost. And if you were doing it with a free product, there may be a support contract you need with like an entity like Library Host to help you get it set up. Even though it's a free product, you still have to pay someone else. That usually happens if you don't have the technical expertise or time in-house to do it on your own. And then, of course, if you already have an existing system and items, you're going to have to do a transfer of those items and go through not only the digital file migration, but the metadata migration. Those are somewhat complicated because we all use our systems somewhat differently. No one system is set up the same. And so you have to figure out that bridge, what will migrate accurately, what won't, and how to mitigate those. And if you're working with a vendor, you're paying the vendor for their time and expertise to do that. Or if you have to do it on your end, while that's not like a check you have to sign, that is costing your time and energy to do that transfer and migration. And of course, to your organization, that is a literal cost. And then another one-time fee thing to consider is any sort of customization you need done on the back end and or the front end. And this usually always, there will need to be at least a little bit of customization in terms of like what cataloging fields you need in your record or how you need things to display on the front end. So whether you're working with a vendor, whether you're working with a contractor or doing it yourself, there's going to be those costs there to get it set up, to get things migrated, and then to get it customized in the way you want it on the back and front end. I'm going to pause for tea. Okay. How to find CMS options to inform the procurement process. So this is us just getting started. These are the baby steps. So first obvious one is ask a friend. Next one, visit a peer organization website, especially if they're a collection that is one you admire or they're viewed as a peer organization. Go check out and see what products they are using. And then if you have a relationship with them or even not, just sending an email or reaching out to see if they like their product, because even if it looks good on the website, they may have had to do quite a bit of work to have that happen. And so it's always good to call and ask if they like that product. Another good place to check is any of your professional associations. Some of them do maintain vendor profiles and examples of collections management system software. They usually, of course, don't endorse any one product, but for example, the Canadian Heritage Institute, I believe, Institute Network, it's CHIN is the acronym. They have a great like whole list of like all the products that you could possibly look at. And I'll go find that link and drop it in the chat for you. And then last one is when you're at conferences, whether virtual or in person, there's usually always an exhibit or an expo hall. And that's where those vendors go during these conferences. And so you can take the opportunity to go and have like a no pressure free conversation with them, go check out their product, go see, get a demonstration on the fly. And that's a good way to get a feel for not only what the products are, but the people who help run them, because usually the people at the expo halls will also be the ones to help onboard you if you were buying into that product. So it's a good way to get a feel for the people too. Another way to find where CMS options are listed. Oh, I spoke ahead of myself. Here you go. The Canadian Heritage Information Network. So the acronym is CHIN. That's their link. I will drop it in the chat and in the YouTube notes. Another good one, which is seemingly random, and if you go to the website, it looks a little out of date, but it's one of the best CMS tables I've seen. And so it's the Car Library and Museum. Another sort of peer or association, but across the pond over in the United Kingdom, is the Collections Trust, and that's their big national group, and they've got a great list, and it captures some of the European vendors, which I mentioned because several of those vendors, I won't call anybody out specifically because I don't want to appear as if I'm endorsing one over another, but there's some great products coming out of Europe right now. And so I do encourage you to go check out that list. I've noticed many of sort of the big prestigious institutions on the East Coast have started implementing with some of the European vendors because what they've been able to do with their front ends has been so engaging and has gotten a lot of good results. So even though it's over in the United Kingdom, I still want you to go check out that list. And then for more general, this software comparison site such as Capterra and G2, they do any type of software. including collections management systems. So you can see like real-time user reviews. And so it's a great way to check out what the users feel and think of the various products out there. All right, how to structure an effective procurement team. And it may seem easy, or it may seem like that's something that your boss will decide, or maybe you are the boss watching this. But it is definitely something to have some input on, whether you're the decision maker or not. And it is something to be strategic about because this is such an important product that you're getting and it will impact so many people. You really need to be thoughtful about it before you get involved in the process, because the last thing you want is somebody having to be added to the team later on that you forgot about, or that person wasn't considered before, because you will lose some ground. And if they're added so late onto the team, it may be too late to actually effectively incorporate any of their needs or insights. And that doesn't do anybody any good. So the more thoughtful you can be about including everyone you need to up front, the better it is for everyone. Nobody wants to redo work. So, things to keep in mind when you're forming a team. It should represent a majority of CMS stakeholders and their needs. It needs to be large enough to be reflective of the stakeholders, but small enough to still be effective. Some people, it's based on a percentage of staff, based on total staff, or it's like a designated random number. Just to give you a range so that this isn't so vague, it's not helpful. Uh, as long as you are not just a one-person shop, which those exist, but as long as there's a few of you, the team should be no smaller than 3 people and no larger than 12. And for the larger organizations, that can be tough, but try and pick representatives that can represent all of those different stakeholder viewpoints. But you don't want a group that's so large that there's just no possible way to get a consensus, let alone find meeting times where everybody can meet. And this is something to keep in mind and actually and make this statement to those you invite to join the procurement team. Make them aware of what that commitment entails, because you don't want the opposite of somebody joining too late. You don't want somebody having to leave halfway because they have to do a different project or what have you, because that will definitely set you back as well. So members should be able to commit fully to this process for the stated duration. And I know you may not know what the duration is at this time, but just know that it could be up to 12 months, depending on what type of organization you are. So it could be as quick as 3 months, but also know that it could be as much as 12 months. So just think about the duration and make sure that that's communicated to the people who will be involved. Okay, this is the fun part for me. I always love seeing what people's ultimate specifications turn out like. And it's an exercise that, while it can be a little stressful or a little frustrating because everybody's got different needs and we got to work it out, it is perhaps the most satisfying exercise that I do with people, because once you have that list that everybody is on board with, it gets exciting at that point. And maybe that's just me. So I apologize for geeking out for a moment. But creating specifications, there are questions for staff to consider. So this is the procurement team, and everybody who, even if they're not on the procurement team, but they're being represented by staff, any staff who uses or will use the CMS, these are things to think about. What tools do I currently use that are required for my job? What tools do I not have that would make my job easier? What tools do I consider as mandatory versus recommended? What tools are so important that it's a deal breaker if the CMS doesn't offer that tool? And so hopefully there are only a few of those deal breakers, but they're definitely something to think about and be aware of, especially with everybody that you're working with. Okay, questions specific to museum operations. And so this may not necessarily be like the collection workers, but maybe it's department heads or people who are adjacent to this type of work. Does the digital file backup meet preservation standards? What are the digital file types in play? Are there digital file size storage requirements? What administrative control levels are available? What customization is needed on both the front and back end, and can the CMS accommodate those needs? What reports or other automation tools are desirable to support museum staff? And then questions specific to decision makers. What is the one-time budget to cover one-time costs? So remember that slide we went over a little while ago in terms of like the implementation, customization, migration. And then what is the annual CMS budget? And is there a plan to increase it year upon year? And so this is thinking of the software as a service where it's a subscription model, you're licensing the product, and or you are also paying for, maybe there's a support contract or a storage contract, any of those annual costs that will be reoccurring. And especially thinking about that increase because there's no guarantee that these prices stay the same forever. Often they don't. And so if your organization has a budget, it needs to be healthy enough to get a CMS that it can afford that annual rate and at a slight increase. Okay, so this is a very simplified sample rubric. Of course, if we were working together or when you do this with your team, it will have more fields, as you can imagine. But just to give you an idea, all of those thought questions and prompts that we just went over in the previous 3 slides, those are to help get your ideas going and help you start making notes of what your requirements are versus what the highly desirable are. And you're going to start populating these into a rubric. And so for each person who is involved in this process, the left-hand column over here is what collections management system we're thinking about and looking at. You're going to list them 1, 2, 3. You can put their names in. I just don't have names in here for now of what those products are. And then across the top, I typically start with what's required first, putting those in here in terms of like, it has to be cloud-based is sometimes a requirement. You have to be able to customize the catalog requirement. And then as we go down, there's the recommended. So things that aren't deal breakers necessarily, but are things that are like, yes, that would certainly help their case if they had it. And then the ultimate question, is that product within budget? Because if it's not, there needs to be a further conversation with the operations person to see if that's possible to increase, or we need to know that we need to stop looking at that product because it's just not going to fit the budget. So within those, we then put, yes, it meets it, no, it doesn't. And it's a really easy way to visually see which products hit the most check marks, so to speak, and the ones that we should be looking further into because they are meeting the most needs. Okay, next is how to test and vet a potential CMS option. Testing steps. Request a sandbox to test the tools. So sometimes vendors can't provide this because they've not set up a proprietary safe way to do that. But if they do offer a sandbox, this is the best way to make sure that the product is actually working how you think it works and helps get you familiar with what it can do. If they can't offer a sandbox, then ask for a tutorial or demonstration. And the most effective way to do this is to actually write out like the very specific actions that you want to see them do, or the very same outcomes, what steps to get to that outcome. That way you can at least see it in action and see if it is working in the way that you think it works. Another thing to ask for is to have each procurement team member test their area of the CMS. So if you've got a fairly modest to large procurement team where people are doing different types of work within the system, you need to make sure that each area works as that person thinks it's supposed to. And you can't test that if you're only testing certain parts or certain people are only testing certain parts. And then, of course, the vetting process. So if you've tested things and it's testing out okay, the next step is to vet them. And the first part is to ask them any other sort of remaining questions or concerns. Ask them about what the next steps in the process are. If you work together, ask to see a contract to be written up if you're considering working with them, those types of things. And then just like if you were hiring a new employee, request the vendor to provide references and ask them to provide references that match your type of use case. So whether that is your type of institution, collection size, how you're using or want to use the CMS, ask them to provide some thoughtful references that can speak to those things. Because the better, more applicable references you receive, the more helpful and insightful they will be. Implementation. So here are the 6 steps for implementation. We're going to get into the detail of each one in a moment. But the 6 steps are: 1, get to know the new CMS. 2, prepare for CMS implementation logistics. 3, learn how the content will exit the existing system and enter the new one. 4, test and troubleshoot. 5, clean up any sort of existing CMS content issues. And 6, establish or reestablish your organization's cataloging best practices. So step number 1, get to know the new CMS. A lot of the vendors nowadays have lessons or tutorials that you can watch. I definitely recommend checking those out if they have a library, or some of them do it like once a month. There is regularly scheduled calls or tutorials that you can join. Next one is read the literature, read whatever directions have come with your system. Many of them now offer wikis and forums that you can drill through to see if somebody's already posed the question you have, or if you can post one yourself if it's a new one. 3, pay attention during the demos for tools specific to your work. So as you were watching the vendor demonstrations, you can ask them again, like if there was a specific thing you need them to show you, and especially if you're working with a vendor that you're paying like a subscription service for, support should be a part of that. So ask them to demo any of the things that you are interested in. Next one is view examples from other institutions using the CMS platform. So remember, part of our initial search was seeing who was using what, and then part of our vetting process was calling those references that are using that software. Between those two connections that you have, ask for them to show you how they're using their software, and new or cool things that they have done that you would like to emulate. And then play in a sandbox version of the CMS, and this is if the vendor does provide a sandbox. For some of the free ones, they don't always do that, but if they do, this is a great opportunity to test different setups, different workflows, how the different tools work. Are they working as intended? And all to give you a sense of what sort of mechanisms you want established and in place, and what sort of features you want to use. Step number 2, logistics. Oh, let me move my little face. Okay. If you're working with a vendor or the software as a service program, have a pre-implementation meeting with the CMS vendor, and this is something that they should be doing, but if they don't, ask for one, and ask them to review the procedures, the timeline, the system and staff requirements that they need from you that need to be in place and ready for a smooth implementation. Now, vendors, if they're good ones, they should already be on top of this and giving you all the information you need. But if they aren't, it's something for you to ask for so that you and your staff can be prepared and successful. And if you're on your own, so for maybe if it's a free product, for example, or a cheaper product, meet with all of the relevant procurement team and technology staff members to walk through what you anticipate the implementation steps will be, and then have each staff person speak to their part in the process and identify what needs to be in place and when, timeline-wise, for successful implementation. So this is where that digital project management piece comes in. If you have staff on hand that can do that and manage that process, great. If you don't, this may be an area where you work with a consultant to help you through that process. Something for you to think about. Step number 3, learning how the content will exit your existing system and enter the new system. So we're getting into the migration part here. First, test exporting small groups of varying collection items. So you want a variety to see what will break or not, and learn how the item data will leave the current CMS. Some of them leave beautifully and are so easy to plug into the new system, usually for newer products. If you're working with an older, maybe free-ish, cheap version, the, what they give you is almost useless sometimes, or takes an extreme amount of you tinkering with it to even be able to import it back into the new system. So knowing what will be involved on your part or on the vendor's part for any of like that data massaging for exporting and importing, you need to have a good sense of that ahead of time and test that out, because depending on what you find will determine what you need to do. Next part is to check to see the quality of the data that exits the CMS and if there's any cleanup that needs to be done. So this is not just like how it exits, but perhaps the data, the metadata specifically in that original record wasn't great to begin with. And I mean, like, didn't follow best practices, for example. So taking a look at that as well, because if you're importing into a new system, you don't want to move trash from one system and put trash in your new system. You want to clean it up. So this is a great opportunity for you to do that before you put trash in the new system. Next is test the importing of small groups of data into the new CMS to check that the new CMS is set up correctly and that it's ingesting and mapping the metadata correctly. So you have the data from your old system. It is in the form it's supposed to be in. It is clean data. You've done the cleanup, or it was already pristine. And then making sure that that import process now is happening cleanly and that it was set up and the metadata is going into the correct fields for the correct records. And you want to do those in test batches because sometimes data can get crossed with the wrong records. I am speaking from experience here, and you don't want to do that for like a whole collection. You want to catch that early on and fix it. And then last, check to make sure all the data is showing up appropriately and note any issues that are occurring. So once you get that data imported, everything's looking good, note any other sort of variances or things that are happening and get those fixed first before you import the rest of your collection. It may sound obvious, but it is worth saying. Test and troubleshoot. So you've done those initial batches. You hopefully have figured out how the data is going to migrate and have like smoothed out that process for yourself. Now is testing and troubleshooting. And I recommend still doing batches as you are doing some regular importing, exporting from one system, importing into the new system. Keep an eye on that, do occasional tests. And then if anything is coming up issue-wise, make sure you're troubleshooting that, whether by yourself or with a vendor. Number 5, clean up existing CMS content. So cleanup is usually involved in this migration part, and it's for reasons we talked about in that previous slide. The data was entered, but it didn't adhere to any sort of professional standards or best practices, and that can happen for a variety of reasons we won't get into right now. Another one is when the data exits the system, it loses or adds data sometimes that it's not supposed to. And then the data enters the new system, it could lose or add data that should not be present, should or should not be present. And then 6, establish or reestablish best practices. So getting a new system is a great time to either establish best practices and procedures if you don't have them, or recommit to them if you do, and maybe even do some updating on documents and directions. And I should do a whole webinar on documentation because I'm very into that. But anyway, this is a great time to make sure you're following best practices, especially with a new system. You should have already gone through all of the migration and cleanup, and so you want to maintain that quality standard of quality that you have in your new system, and so that means adhering to those best practices. All right, things I want you to think about during this process that didn't necessarily fit into any of these steps. Where is the data stored at each step, especially if you're paying for it to be stored in one place first and then having to move it to someplace else? You need to be aware of where your data is, and especially if it costs money, you need to maintain those costs as you're transitioning. Another thing to think about is how long do you keep the old system running, and is it going to overlap with your new system running? For several organizations, I have seen them pay for two contracts essentially for a year so that they've had time to do the migration at a steady pace, to do testing, to make sure everything made it to the new system appropriately before they shut down the old system. So something to think about. It's not ideal paying for two systems at the same time, but it needs to be a conscious decision on your part. Next one, to what level of detail do you keep the decision makers in the loop? And this is going to depend on the procurement team and who your decision maker or makers are. Hopefully it's not so often of a communication where it's taking up time for you and the decision maker, but you do want to make sure that any sort of important developments, any sort of concerns that have popped up or great news that's popped up, that it's being communicated in a consistent manner. Another thing is, how are you going to migrate and test the data? And we went through that step together. So what I mean by this point is it going to be you and only you as the staff members on the procurement team that's doing this process? Are you going to work with a contractor or a consultant to help you do that part of the process? Because it is very laborious depending on how many collection items you need to migrate and test. And so it's very reasonable or conceivable that you would hire somebody to help you do that, especially if you don't have a vendor or staff time to help you. And the third option is that you've picked a product and you're paying the cost for the vendor to do that migration. So as you can see, there's a scale of options as to who's doing that work. And it's important that you, as the procurement team, have made that conscious decision on how that work is getting done, because it is so much work. And then last, what external systems rely on the CMS and how will their connection be addressed? And so an obvious one here is your website and your blog, if you have one. If you have linked the collections management system to various aspects of your website or in the blog, obviously all of those are going to need to be updated and changed. So start thinking about that as you're doing this transition, because you'll have to address those too. Tools to consider as you're looking at products and looking at what sort of tools and features you want to turn on in your products. First of all, ADA compliance, and more specifically, the WCAG Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, I think is that acronym. I will post the link, but I think it's like WCAG3.org or something. I'll post the link, I promise. Going through those, it's a great wiki of what to look for and how to make your website, and in this case, a collections management system, accessible according to best practices and guidelines. And so that's definitely something to think about. And if you're working with a vendor, learning how to turn on those switches or what have you, if you need to make sure that you are compliant. Next thing to think about is the collaborative front end to a multiple back end option. And this is for those organizations that we talked about at the very beginning that could have like a library and archives and museum all together, that may want different back ends because we all use different best practices and different catalog templates. But to the user, they want to search everything in one portal. This could also be the same for those collaborative, like two different peer museums, for example. They have a shared collection purview, and so users want to search both of those museum collections, but on the back end, they need to stay separate. So many vendors, especially the bigger ones that I'm seeing now, are building this option in. And if that's something you know that you'll need, that is something to think about when you're having these conversations and going through that specification process. Another tool is thinking about any sort of dynamic visualization and download capabilities that are present for the product. Our users are so typically visually driven that if your CMS isn't built and you're not using the features that encourage browsing and encourage user engagement, then your system's not being used to the best of its ability. So work with your vendor or work with, um, play around with options and how to present your collections dynamically. And things to use that help play into that are canned searches, doing those photo or media carousels, and using any other sort of browse tools that are available to you. Another thing to think about is, especially if your collections are multimedia, having the ability to embed and stream media within your collections management system is so much more preferable than either having the user need to download the file, which is not ideal for several reasons, or having to send them to a different site. That's not ideal or best practice either. So having it contained and playable within your system is ideal. Think about user-generated content. If you're the type of organization that loves to have your audience engage with your content and help like with transcription or photo identification, many of the software I'm seeing now is starting to have that feature that you can turn on. And then, of course, social media sharing. I know that as collection workers, that's not the first thing we think about in terms of how we want the collections to be used. But we do need to make sure that they are easily shareable, whether that is on Facebook or in somebody's research report. Having those abilities for people to either share on social media or create their own curated lists are great user tools. And thinking about money, and I have a whole webinar on this, so I'm going to keep it short and link to that webinar on understanding our income streams. But the collections management system can help support income streams, and that's what I want you to be aware of and start learning more about, especially because the collections management system can be one of our most expensive assets that we need to do our job. So think about how the collections management system can support visitorship, encourage and inspire visitorship and member passes. Collections management systems can absolutely support and help win grant and foundation funding because they are a great tool to get the collections out there to anybody with an internet connection. So use the CMS for those. They're also a great way to encounter and prove value and worth to donors and endowments. Maybe there's special things donors can do with collections in the management system or be honored in the collection records or feature or spotlight. Adopt artwork, for example, is a great creative way I've seen it done. So think about how you can engage them there. And then any sort of municipal, local government, et cetera, or business sponsorships, how can the collections management system help serve them and support their interests? And again, I go into much greater detail in a separate webinar if you're interested in learning more. Okay, examples of what a good CMS can do. They can highlight items in need of conservation treatment through reporting. They can demonstrate how collection objects are on display or not. So using those statistics and using the collections management system to get that type of information of like what needs to be rotated off, what collections are underrepresented, those types of things. You can prove collection use by tracking statistics. So collections aren't just what we see in the exhibit halls or in the archives. They're what are also in our management system and what the users are looking at. And so tracking those statistics to see what is interesting to our users is very valuable information. A collections management system can also address any sort of legal or ethical questions. So thinking about provenance and decolonization and repatriation. The collections management system is a great place to see past practices and start to amend them. And a good CMS can decrease lost or misplaced objects because, of course, a good one we can track and say, okay, that object went in for treatment or that object is out on loan. They can support enjoyment, research, and education for us and our users. You can use it to help increase your digital user engagement, thinking about those canned searches, those photo carousels, those engagement portals, points of engagement, etc. And then they can contribute to the museum income stream by supporting the four main ones we talked about in the previous slide. So here are some cliff notes for you to help make your case to your decision maker, because again, a collections management system can be a very expensive endeavor. First, explain what a CMS is and its role in the museum organization as needed. You may think your executive director knows what you're doing and how important it is, but I find it is worth explaining at least a little bit with whoever is in charge. Next one, outline what exists currently. So often the question is, well, you already have a collections management system. Why do you need a new one? Like that is definitely like a verbatim thing I hear a lot. So you need to outline what it is that you have and then how it's not working. So going with the next bullet point, demonstrate with numbers and narrative, so like quantitative and qualitative data, how either no system, if you don't have one, or your current not great system is impacting your ability to take care of your objects, to manage your objects, and how it's impacting the people who want to use your objects via the collections management system. Another one is to offer examples of what a good CMS can do to help alleviate your issues. So, talk about yourself and how it could make your job easier, save you some time and money, maybe, but also talk about those things that we covered in the last slide in terms of what a good CMS can do for your organization, but also for your community. Another thing is to highlight peer museum CMS implementations. And specifically, I mean, use that competition factor or like that, keeping up with the Joneses factor in terms of, oh, well, our peer museum over there has this system and this is what they're doing. Maybe even get some of their statistics if you can to show how good their system is and how good your system could be. Another thing to think about is providing a budget and logistic details that need to be considered. So, usually, if you're getting like an immediate no, it may be because of budget, sure, but it also may be because the higher ups, decision makers, don't necessarily understand what the costs actually are. They usually will expect them to be much more. And then also, sorry, motorcycle. And then also any sort of the logistic details. So, like the whole process that we've covered in this webinar, there's a lot to it and it can be overwhelming for your boss as well. And so, sometimes just laying it out for them can help alleviate and help get past like that immediate no. And then, of course, making the ask. Actually ask for a new system and make that case. All right. Oh, little face. Okay. A note about funding. So, we've talked about how expensive a collections management system can be, not just for the product itself, but also because of the staff time and cost. Maybe you need to hire a consultant or a contractor to help you through the procurement phase and or through the implementation and migration phase. And so if you need funding, there is funding out there. And so I did want to point out that there are, whether it's for a CMS assessment, which is great to do at the very beginning, a CMS acquisition, or CMS implementation, you can find digital collection specific grants through national grants like the Institute of Museum and Library Services, National Park Service, National Endowment for Humanities, and the Council on Library and Information Research. And that's just like a few of them. There are many others, but those are some good ones to start with. And then at the local, like the state level, the Library Services and Technology Act distributes federal funds to the state level. And that is where a lot of the clients that I have worked with, if they've paid for my time with grant funding, it has almost always been through an LSTA grant. So definitely worth looking into, in addition to any of the local to you grant sources that would be a good fit. Also, grant writing is one of my other specialties. And so I have an ebook that you can go get. It's a free ebook, or if you like a paper copy, you can go get it on Amazon. And then very recently, I teamed up with Lucidia to create a grant writing toolkit. And so building off of the grant book and building off some of the other webinar resources that are available, we've created a grant directory for North American, like national level grants, both federal and private. And we've created it so that you can actually do like drill down searching based on award type, project type, things like that, that aren't being offered anywhere else. And in addition to that, we also put together a workbook for you, especially if you are new or you've not written a whole lot of grants. This is a great workbook for you to go get that has plug and play templates and 4 project examples for you to use as you apply for some of those grants. So go check out all of those resources if funding is something that you need. Okay, when to consider working with an expert. You may have heard me talk about getting whether it's a digital project manager or a consultant to help you go through the selection and vetting process. So here is where that makes sense. If it's been more than 5 to 10 years since staff has shopped or implemented a new CMS, if there isn't enough availability from staff to put in the work over a lengthy period of time, if there isn't the expertise or availability of experts on the team to help lead the project, if there's complication factors involved, which could be multiple partners in the organizational sense, mixed collections, whether it's library, museum, archives, or the back end and front end customization is needed and you don't have that already. Another reason is that you want someone to lead you through the process from beginning to end, limiting staff overwhelm and helping to protect staff time. So maybe you have the expertise, but you don't have the time, or vice versa. And then you need an outside expert to provide professional opinion to use as an advocacy tool with decision makers and or granting agencies. And this is for the scenario where you may have the staff expertise and you may even have the staff time, but getting buy-in from your decision makers, the people who actually pay for the system, whether that is your boss or granting agency, sometimes just having that outside perspective and expert opinion is more persuasive than if you had communicated the very same need or decision. And then another resource I want to make sure you go grab is I have written a small book. I promise it is small, but it helps lead you through this whole process. So if there were any parts that you weren't quite clear on that I went over today, this book does a great job of going into depth, going in with some examples of how to go through these different steps in the process. And so you can go pick up a free e-copy there. Or again, if you like physical books, you can go get a physical book from Amazon. Other free resources, my little face, okay. Digital collection management services as well as grant services. I offer both as a consultant. So if you're curious as to how I work with people on either of those two, please go check that out. And then with grants, last year I did a huge focus on webinars and courses. If you're interested in those, you can go check that out. The grant toolkit that I just talked about that has the directory with faceted search and the workbook, you can go get it there. I've written tons of blog posts for Lucidia on collections management systems. They are system agnostic, meaning I don't talk about any particular product. So you can apply this to any sort of product that you have, similar with the webinars. And then this webinar and all of the other webinars that I have done, you can go check them out on my YouTube channel. As I said earlier, I'll be focusing on collection management systems and digital collection work this year. So this is the first of many webinars you'll see. And then if in case you made your way to this webinar and you're not already a part of my newsletter community, please sign up if you are interested, because I usually send all of this type of information out to my community first. And then contact and connect if you have any follow-up questions, want to get in touch. This is my information right here. You can connect with me on LinkedIn if you haven't already, or on Twitter if you are on Twitter. And this webinar definitely went an hour or so long, and I incorporated most of the information that you need. But if you have any questions, please shoot me an email, consulting@rachelchristine.com. And thank you so much for attending today, and I really appreciate you being here. If you need help around something specific or have ideas for the webinars that you'd like to see from me, please let me know. I'm still in the process of creating what this next year will look like, so I would be happy for your input. All right, thanks so much. Take care.